Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to World Affairs Today. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening as we examine the question, to seal or not to seal, addressing the U.S.-Mexico border. We are coming to you from the Jack Morton Auditorium of the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Our guest speakers are Dr. James Carafano, currently a senior fellow at George Washington University's Homeland Security Policy Institute, and Dr. Andrew Selee, director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. They will both be more formally introduced in a moment by our moderator, Manuel Roig-Franzia, from the Washington Post newspaper. For years now, there have been calls in the United States to seal the border between the states and our neighbor to the south, Mexico, our third largest trading partner, with which we share the most frequently crossed international border in the world, with approximately 250 million crossings each year. The related issues are numerous and each one complex in itself: immigration, drugs, illegal trade in guns, economic impact on the border states here in the country, and on the agricultural sector of the U.S. economy. And of course, the implications for an impact on Mexico, to name only a few. Mr. Roig-Franzia has a long history of reporting on the issues of Mexican-American border security. He served as the bureau chief for the Washington Post in Mexico City. He specialized in topics such as immigration, drug trafficking, and Latin American culture. He currently writes for the Post Style section, and he teaches a graduate-level course at the Corcoran College of Art and Design. He is a graduate of UCLA and received his master's from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, Mr. Manuel Roig-Franzia.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I think that the border is one of those topics that, as they say in showbiz, needs no introduction. We don't have to make a large statement to say how important it is. 1,954 miles between the United States and Mexico, patrolled by more than 17,000 agents, according to recent testimony. And we're lucky to have with us here tonight two people who have thought about this a lot. Andrew Selee from the Wilson Center and James Carafano from Heritage. And so I think we should get straight to the subject. Andrew, you said something once that struck me as sort of a good starting point for us. You said, at some point we got the misconception that border security means securing the border. What does that mean?
Well, Manuel, from where I sit, and I should say that though I work at the Wilson Center, we don't take official positions on this, but my personal, position, having done a bit of research on the U.S.-Mexico border, is we tend to think that a secure border, we've come to think, I think, often the secure border is about how we keep people from coming in. And the reality is, in a globalized world, it's very hard to do that. It's hard to, we depend on our borders to let goods through. We have about $1 billion a day of trade with Mexico. For example, 23 states in the United States depend on Mexico as their leading or second trading partner or destination for exports. But we also depend on how we secure borders, and we make judgments about how secure that is and what we want to secure against, whether it's terrorism, whether it's against organized crime, and whether it's against immigration. And so we've had a bit of a debate in this country over the past few years thinking that we did close down the border. But the real question is, how do we make choices, and how do we use risk management to make sure that goods flow and people flow in ways that they need to, that benefit our economy? And at the same time, we do risk management to make sure that things that can do us harm are controlled. And much of how we have to do that has to be done away from the border. I mean, some things we can do by putting people on the border to inspect cars, to inspect trucks, to stop people from crossing between entry points. But much of how we need to protect the border is using good intelligence beyond the border, making sure people don't ever get to the border and don't cross it. And that requires a lot of cooperation between the partners on both sides of the border. We're fortunate with Mexico to have a partner who is concerned about some of the same things we are, particularly terrorism and organized crime. And so working together to figure out what are the real threats and how we prevent them from ever getting to the border is often a better system than trying to stop things once they get there and are hidden away.
I think anybody who's visited the border region knows that it takes a little bit of time to get from one side to the other. What kind of an effect does that have on this important trade between these two countries? I mean, I know that when I've spoken to people along the border, they complain about violence, and they also complain about long lines at the checkpoint.
It's a huge issue. I mean, you can often wait for a couple hours to get across the border as a passenger. As a truck, you can wait several hours. And Mexico is about 12, 13, 14%, depending on the month of our trade. If you add in Canada, it's almost a third of U.S. trade with the two countries. And so these wait times take a toll on our economy. They take a toll on I mean, the cost of wait times is basically passed on to consumers, right? It's passed on in the goods that we purchase. It is a disincentive for exporting goods and for importing goods. And it certainly makes it harder for us to have the fluid trading relationship that we'd like to have with Mexico, and probably even more than the wait times, which adds cost, is unpredictability. What we find is for just-in-time manufacturing, about 40%, actually, this is a great statistic that my colleague Chris Wilson has been working on, and some research he's done is about to publish. About 40% of the content in Mexican exports to the United States are actually U.S. made. What we're seeing is a lot of the goods that we call exports or imports are goods that move back and forth across the border continuously. There's just-in-time manufacturing going on. This is particularly true of cars, but it's also true of a lot of other industries. And so the question is, how can you have predictability so that businesses know how long the wait time is so they can make sure to get things to the factory in time, and then the semi-finished product or the finished product back across again. So basically with the wait times, what we're doing is adding costs, but we're also adding unpredictability that makes it hard to have joint manufacturing.
Let's bring James in here. Is it possible to have predictability given the many, many variables that exist in that complicated region?
Well, first of all, I got to tell you, this is going to be a terrible debate. because we actually agree on the basic question, which is, do you secure the border at the border? And the answer is no. It's part of a flaw. So the economic piece is important. When you pull in the immigration and the criminal piece, though, you need to kind of broaden the discussion just a little bit before you get to there. So you look at the immigration piece, and the answer is pretty simple. I mean, so when you look south of the border into Latin America, you have very, very robust demographics. You have still pretty rapidly growing populations, with a bulge in that population in the age group that's both very productive and tends to be very mobile in the teens to early 2030s. You also have in many Latin American economies, very poor growth creation or wealth creation, and in Mexico in particular. So you've got robust demographics and relatively slow economic growth. And then if you translate that and you look north, you have, and again, this is all relative, you have relatively slowing growing demographics in the United States and Canada, and until recently, pretty good economic growth. So there is this natural migration of labor from south to north, and that's just a fact of life. And it's actually not just an issue for the United States, it's actually a global issue. The whole world's getting older. Don't feel bad, okay? This is actually a unique.
Not me.
No. This is a unique time in human history where the whole, the developed world always ages. We get that, right? But the developing world is aging, and even the undeveloped world, right, the populations are getting older. People are living longer, but it's most dramatic in the developed world. And so there is this demand for labor in that age group. And there's an interesting set of countries demographically. They're called the labor frontier, which is a handful of countries in the world that have some very special characteristics. They're developing nations, so they do have a robust population in that middle area. There's a modicum of education, so they're somewhat mobile because they can write and add and subtract. And there's a modicum of infrastructure, so they can move, right? And that is actually the world's labor supply. And the world actually fights over that. And ironically, the United States in many ways is blessed. We have one of the countries of the labor frontier right at our doorstep. And so we have access to really one of the best labor pools in the world, where other people are not only fighting for those labor pools, but the countries that they're drawing from them have a lot of issues that Mexico doesn't have. So there's a natural migration of labor from south to north that's going to be there I think, for some decades to come, because the demographics are not going to change. And even if there is economic growth and reform in Latin America, it's certainly not going to happen overnight, and we're not going to have dramatically strong and robust economies, with the exception of maybe a Brazil or something. And so that's a fact of life. And the other piece is.
But if I could interject right here, and I'm going to ask Andrew this, because I know you spent a lot of time in Mexico, and haven't some Mexican leaders said that there would come a time, and that time would be in the not so distant future, when the United States would be begging for workers from Mexico rather than blocking their entrance?
We've heard that, and certainly the dynamics will change. I mean, between 2015 and 2020, there should be an aging population, what James says, an aging population in Mexico. That means that there are fewer people in the demographics that tend to migrate coming across the border. Fewer people willing, people will be older, people have families, they'll be less willing to take the risk. That said, there still is about a 4 to 5 to 1, either 4 to 1 or 5 to 1 gap in average income between Mexico and the United States, right? I mean, which means that there will continue to be a draw of people to come to this country.
So it's hyperbole?
I think it's hyperbole. I think it isn't irrelevant. I think it's something we should take into account. It's certainly going to lessen pressures. We've seen it right now. I mean, right now there's probably a net negative flow of people coming illegally to the United States, not of people coming from Mexico. Right. I mean, there's still a positive number of people coming from Mexico. Mexico's about a quarter of the legal immigration flow of the United States. What we're seeing is actually about 150 to 200,000 people coming each year, and about the same number leaving each year to Mexico. So for the first time in a long time, probably in 3 decades or more, we're actually seeing a net outflow of people, or at least a net neutral flow of people coming illegally to this country. Yeah. I'm not sure that's demographics as much as it's the bad U.S. economy, but it could be the beginning of that. It could at least be changing the pressures, but I don't think it's going to stop them.
Yeah. Can I just very quickly just kind of add to the depth of that, because I think these are important fundamentals to understand before you get into a discussion, which is why people come here. And then there's this perception that they come here because they want benefits, or which isn't true, or higher wages, which generally isn't true. Generally, people come because there are opportunities for wealth creation in the United States that you just don't have in Mexico. So, for example, and again, this until a couple of years ago, if you wanted to build a house in Mexico, you couldn't get a mortgage. So you came to the United States, you built up some capital, you went back to Mexico and built a house. Here you used to be able to get a mortgage. That may not be true anymore. But
tried recently.
So it has as much to do with wealth, the ability to create wealth, as it is with this wages and benefits. And I think that's often missed. And so it is as much a problem about the Mexican economy as it is about the draw of the U.S. economy.
Well, since we're talking about numbers and we're talking about undocumented people coming into the United States, maybe you could talk a little bit about what the Obama administration is doing right now. I thought it was very interesting that in July, you had news that the Obama administration was deporting people at a higher rate than the Bush administration. In August, we got news that there was going to be a shift in policy, and there would be only the quote-unquote worst of the worst would be deported. How do you see that playing out now, and give us a little bit of a political analysis on that?
Yeah, it's not about stopping people from coming to the country. Okay, you're brought here under false pretenses. So no reasonable person is going to sit here and argue that sealing the border is a good idea, even if it could be done, which arguably it can't. But what we both really have an interest in is having that civil society and security and economic be regular, normal. And if everybody could do this under the rules, we would all prefer that. So it's how do you get that system, that flow back and forth to work in the light, in the way that everybody can be fair and above board, as opposed to being forced into a track that's illegal. I mean, we're actually as concerned about the fate of people who are here unlawfully and they're mistreated and the problems they're under. All reasonable people are concerned. Nobody thinks that having a population that has to be in your country and doesn't have the benefit of the rule of law is a good thing.
But wouldn't regular and normal be words that could be associated with guest worker programs or an immigration reform law, things that have been sort of stalled right now?
Yeah, and actually I'm a huge proponent of guest worker programs. But to answer your question, which is, how do you get the system to work right? Which is, I think, where reasonable people can have issues with. The administration's argument is we are being very efficient in the application of resources because we are going after the most dangerous aliens. I think that's a bit of bait and switch, right? Nobody should have a law enforcement strategy that says your priority is not going after people that do violent and horrendous crimes. I mean, that to me is kind of, everybody should do that. But that is an excuse, in a sense, not to enforce the rest of the law. That's where I would part company with the administration, and it's a basic argument of strategy and philosophy about how do you get people to obey the law. So, and there is a big debate here, I acknowledge that. So a couple of years ago, there were some political scientists who introduced something called the broken windows theory. It was a very, very famous article that was introduced in the magazine in New York, help me out, what's the name of the magazine? Manhattan Institute.
Wilson and
in the Manhattan Institute's magazine, which City magazine.
Yeah.
Anyway, and their argument is if you want general compliance with the law, that of course you enforce the law at the top end, you go after the people that are the most dangerous, but you don't stop there. It says you have to create a culture of compliance, and the best way to create a culture of compliance is actually to start at the low end. And so what they said is you actually enforce petty laws like jaywalking and spitting on the sidewalk and all the rest. And what you will find is that will actually create an environment in which people are more respectful of the law. And when Mayor Giuliani was elected mayor, he instituted this in Manhattan. It was called the broken windows theory, where they had actually people out writing tickets for squeegee users and jaywalkers and all the rest. Now, you can't argue with the argument that the crime rate in New York City plummeted. Now, you can argue about the cause and effect, about whether that strategy actually implemented that. And we have huge debates in this country about what's the relationship between crime and other things. As a matter of fact, we just had a very remarkable thing, is our economy's in the tubes, and apparently crime is down as well. And you would think the opposite. You would think that the poorer people are, the more violent they are. But I think that immigration enforcement is a broken windows problem. That unless you create a compliance, that the law of the U.S. actually means something, that the notion that the law can never be enforced is relatively hopeless. Now, just to finish that thought, it's not to say that I think that we should go and round up 11 million people and deport them. I think, A, it's impractical, and B, I also think it's unnecessary. But I do think we have to have sufficient enforcement to have people believe that the immigration laws of the United States are credible.
Well, Andrew,
Can I jump in on that?
Yeah, please do.
I think we actually have a point to debate here.
Well, good.
Well, then I'll just change my view. I mean, no.
That would also undercut his initial assessment of what was going to happen here, too. So you score at least 1 point there.
Well, I think we largely agree on the fact that the goal is to have a regular, orderly legal process, right? And we need to be moving towards that. And there are ways we can do this. We should probably talk about that a bit. I think actually in this country we don't do broken windows policy. And in fact, New York certainly doesn't and never did. I mean, we don't enforce speeding laws everywhere equally. We make choices about where it is more important, where there's in fact hazards from speeding, to enforce them. Occasionally, city governments and counties also decide to enforce speeding laws where it's easiest to do, like a downhill somewhere in a rural area, simply because they want to raise some money. But generally speaking, we make decisions about speeding laws where we think there is some social value to making sure people actually do stick within the speed limit. We do the same thing, and I was with someone from New York today who said to me, New York has got to be the biggest drug bazaar in the world. I mean, it's the biggest drug consumption place in the world. It probably is. There's probably more people consuming illegal narcotics in New York than any other city in the world, just given the population size and drug use in this country. We've never actually tried to shut that down. What New York has done very effectively is make drug trafficking less violent. And this has actually been the strategy. I mean, this goes back to
that we've never tried to shut down drug consumption in the United States. I mean, hasn't there been an Office of Drug Control in the White House for a million years? Wasn't there a war on drugs? Wasn't there a don't say no, just say no policy? I mean,
We have, yes,
Boy.
but we've never spent the resources.
Don't tell my mom I said that. Yeah.
In this country, generally speaking, police enforce. If they catch you in flagrante with almost anything, they will obviously pursue you. But in terms of where limited resources are spent and where prosecutors' limited resources are spent, tend to be on the most violent crimes and tend to be on the crimes that create the greatest social disruption. This is how we enforce drug laws in the United States. I mean, if you do something dumb, if you are selling drugs in front of a police officer, you're likely to be caught. But if you're a small-time marijuana dealer, the police and the prosecutors are going to spend fairly little effort to try and round you up, unless you get violent or you're doing it in a public place near a school involving children in some way, or doing something that they see as a public nuisance, simply because law enforcement and prosecutors don't have the ability to do that. This is actually how we enforce most laws. It's simply a choice with limited resources how we do this. And coming back to immigration, I mean, I think this is the kind of choices we're faced with. I mean, since we can't round up and deport 12 million people, I think there is a good argument to be made, and here I would agree with James. If you do something that gets you caught clearly in flagrante, I mean, there is no reason to say you should not be deported, unless there are extenuating circumstances, and that's what courts are for. However, in terms of where we spend limited resources in prosecution and in policing, that is a judgment question, and we judge how ambitious we want to be. The judgment has been made for political grounds in the past. We've either sped it up or slowed it down, depending on how people want to change their immigration policy.
And so this is the key. We're having a real debate, which is about how do you create a culture of compliance, right? The way we enforce immigration laws is not based on an honest debate about strategies. It's based on the politics of the time, and that's why the immigration laws don't work. So if we could sit down, we'd have a debate, and eventually, and we could get the other political scientists and law enforcement guys in the room, and we could maybe come to a consensus about what's a reasonable strategy to create compliance for the law. But that's not what's driving how the law is enforced. I mean, this administration is being just as political about the enforcement as the last administration was, and how they enforce the law. And that's always the problem with immigration.
Well, let's track it back to that. I mean, is the Obama administration getting it wrong or getting it right now, in your mind?
I think they are. What we've seen in the past few years, the reason the numbers have gone up so much is since the Bush administration, continuing the Obama administration, there's been great continuity in locking in certain kinds of programs that automatically get you deported. That essentially, if they catch you, this was 287G, but it's also secure communities, programs where they check your immigration status if you get in the criminal justice system. This has become locked in. I mean, the Obama administration has actually dropped the number of raids. What we've seen is sort of measures of enforcement are locked into other kinds of criminal areas in the criminal justice system. What they've now tried to do is create a discretional way to limit that. I actually think there's probably more resources being spent than are necessary on immigration enforcement. It's probably not in the high interest of the country compared to other laws that we might want to be enforcing, including trying to get violence rates down. They have been dropping, but it'd be great to drop them further. That said, I agree with James. It's an entirely political decision. I mean, this has been, the Obama administration is being just as political about it as the Bush administration and as everyone else before them, and it has very little to do with substance and merits. No one is sitting down and saying, this is a rational way to change policy. And there, I think we have to bring it back to Congress. I think Congress has really been derelict here. We've actually seen, I think, 2 administrations in a row, a Republican administration and a Democratic administration, that have tried to have an earnest debate about how to move this forward. And I would give Bush great credit, actually, for having had the most serious debate about this, actually, in 2006, 2007. We have not seen Congress capable of trying to have the same sort of rational debate that we would expect them to have. And so we're stuck with an immigration system that's basically was designed in 1965. Back when we had a very different kind of economy, we had very different immigration flows. We've done patchworks on it since 1965, but it's largely that system. And we have not been able to get Congress to sit down and say, how can reasonable people, disagree, but also come to a conclusion on what we do?
So if the Obama administration is playing politics, I think, to summarize what you're saying there, is it working?
No, I actually think that this administration has poisoned any hope for a comprehensive approach to border security and immigration reform, because what they literally have tried to do is to please both constituencies simultaneously. They've tried to, on the one hand, argue, yes, we are serious about border security, we are serious about immigration enforcement, and then they've winked, and to the other hand, they've tried to prove a constituency we're doing everything possible to keep these people here and make them legal as quickly as we possibly can. And people aren't stupid. I think both sides look at that and look at the administration. They literally lack credibility with both the proponents of amnesty and they lack credibility with people who want the immigration law enforced. So I think they've poisoned the environment. Now, the Congress is a different, Congress can't lead on this issue. And here's the reason why, is because immigration is not a liberal conservative issue and it's not a Republican Democrat issue. Immigration is the quintessential all politics are local. Immigration is a legal issue. And even if we had every Republican in the room and we said, okay, we're gonna lock the Democrats out, you guys just solve this, they would have a horrible debate. If you lock the Republicans out and said the Democrats, okay, you guys just solve this and we'll just tell the Republicans this is the deal, they would have a vicious debate. Because it's not, you can't, Congress is designed to represent the people of America, and all of Americans are not of one mind on this issue, and the reasons they're not on one mind of this issue are very complicated. It has to do with politics, it has to do with politics, has to do with economics, it has to do with where you live, it has to do with lots and lots of factors. So it's very difficult to see how Congress is going to lead on this issue.
Do you feel the same way? You think Congress can't take that ball and run with it, so to speak?
I think we expect them to, and I have to say they came close with some pressure from the administration, and I do agree the Obama administration has been ambivalent on this, have tried to please both sides. I think the Bush administration did the same thing. I think the Bush administration was actually more assertive on this issue than the Obama administration has been, but they both played both sides actually on this. Yeah. I always think of immigration a little bit like a rural road somewhere that has a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, and suddenly, back when it was a rural road and it didn't really connected two small villages, didn't matter so much, but now they've become large cities, and people are moving trucks between one and the other, and they're not going 30 miles an hour anymore. They're going 50 miles an hour, and it's a pretty safe, straight road. Now, you have two choices here. One is either you try and raise the speed limit. You recognize the fact that circumstances have changed. You make it 50 miles an hour, you make it 45, you figure out what's safe and what's appropriate, or you try and put a lot of cops out there and enforce it. You can put a lot of police officers on the road and try and enforce the law as is. You'll probably raise some money, but you're going to anger a lot of citizens in the process. And this is, I think, where both the Bush and the Obama administrations have been stuck, which is they see a law that is no longer enforceable. The quotas that we have for people coming from other parts of the world are not in consonance with the demand and supply, right? There are more people who want to come to this country. There were, until recently, and this has clearly changed in the past couple of years, but there were more jobs out there than the quotas allowed. And so the question is, do we enforce the laws that we know make no sense, or do we try and, which will hopefully get some people to come over and vote for a change in the law, or do we simply try and enforce it only when we think it actually involves the safety of citizens, the security of people, and in that case, we are not in full compliance with the law. We're going to be seen as not going full speed ahead. It's a tough situation if you're a Democratic or Republican administration. I agree this doesn't cut across clear partisan or ideological lines. It's a tough situation, and they both ended up playing both sides of this. Mm-hmm. I tend to fall into the camp that says if the laws are unenforceable, you enforce them primarily when it is there is a larger national interest and there's a larger interest for security and safety of citizens. I worry about criminal immigrants as I do worry about criminals in general, people who have committed major crimes. I would be less inclined to spend lots of resources enforcing minor immigration infractions in the way that we spend fewer resources in enforcing other kinds of minor infractions, including, speeding in areas that are not terribly unsafe.
You said a word that you hear all the time when you talk to people about this issue, and that is stuck. That we're stuck, it's such a complicated problem, it's so hard, the politics are so difficult. And when I hear that, I have to say, I've been wondering, who benefits from the status quo? Who benefits from the issue being stuck? Because somebody must, right?
Primarily politicians who have constituencies who have very strong feelings on these issues, and if they believe that their constituency that has very strong feelings believes that the politicians are supporting it, then they're happy. But literally nobody else benefits from this. So, for example, you can make the argument, well, I get cheap lettuce, right? That because I have this illegal labor, food's cheaper. Well, that's actually not true. You're paying for that lettuce. I mean, now you may be paying 63 cents at the grocery store, but all the other burdens of having somebody be unlawfully present, whether it comes in incarceration or anything else, that burden's being paid on. You're paying for it somewhere, right?
Really, do you buy that argument that the lettuce is not going to be 63 cents? You know, that we can't analyze it that way?
No, I think that's true. I mean, I think what we do know is that, in fact, there may be some savings in labor costs. But frankly, most business leaders you talk to who employ illegal workers, who employ people who do not have documents, will tell you they'd much rather have them with legal documents. They'd much rather have the security, right, and not have to worry about possibly losing, having a workforce that's taken away, or not being able to find people in time. Now, whether they'll go out and fight for it is a different question. The system works fairly well for some employers in some industries right now.
Okay.
But very few people, when
Okay,
you go and
but
talk to
which
employers, very few would say they
employers?
really prefer illegal immigration as a way of doing their business. I actually agree with James on this. I mean, I think politicians benefit. I think there are, being perfectly honest, and I think immigration is a net benefit for this country. I think economically, part of the diversity of this country, but part of also the constant renewal since the beginning of the United States has been immigrants coming in, bringing entrepreneurship, bringing ingenuity, bringing new ideas, bringing new cultures. I mean, that's part of what makes us great as a country. That said, there are really local dislocations that take place. Some are psychological, some are real. Real is a school that has to adapt to a new immigrant population, to a different language, who has to get bilingual teachers, a medical system that has to deal with people who don't have insurance because they're very recent immigrants. I mean, there are dislocations that go on, and some are psychological. People who simply are used to a uniform community, or what they think is a uniform community, which is suddenly becoming more diverse. Those are dislocations that people at least see as being real. Does the net benefit outweigh that? Yes. If we gave people legal ways of coming in, would they then have insurance? Would it be much easier to deal with how they integrate into the education system? Would they be more active in local politics? Sure. So the answer is trying to make sure people can come in legal ways. But you can understand how people at a local level look at some of these issues when people particularly come in for the first time into their community and worry about it and raise concerns.
Can I just, because I think this is something we actually also agree on, which is immigrants add value to the U.S. economy. And all immigrants add value to the U.S. economy, even low-wage immigrants. And that's actually a very simple thing is okay, that low-wage immigrant's only making $10 an hour. What value is he adding to the economy? Well, if he's mowing my lawn at $10 an hour, and I'm a lawyer and I'm making $500 an hour, and I can spend that hour being a lawyer instead of mowing my lawn, the net benefit to the economy is $490 of economic creativity. So even low-wage labor adds value to the economy. So I don't think the debate is about whether immigrants are good for the economy. They are. Now here's the big debate, which is what's better to the economy, a lawful immigrant or an unlawful immigrant? And this one, the people, draw blood on it. And I think at the end of the day is the economy in the macro level really doesn't give a damn if the employee, because the economy is going to find a way to assign those transactional costs to that being period, whether they're transparent in terms of paying taxes or whether they're hidden in terms of just, I'm using the emergency room. The economy is going to figure that out. And so in the macro level, the economy doesn't care if the worker is illegal or illegal. The argument that, well, if we just give amnesty, it'll be a huge boom to the economy, that's not really true. We're just going to move some transaction costs around. So it's, in a sense, and you're right, and here's where we disagree, which is you're saying the law is not enforceable. That's where I completely disagree. The law is enforceable if we create a system in which the law can operate rationally. So part of the problem, as you rightly point out, and I know this is hard to believe when we're at 9% unemployment, but we're not going to be at 9% unemployment forever, is this economy has never had a sufficient influx of workers to meet the demands. And we have always argued that we need an economy where employers can get the employees they need when they need them to grow their businesses, grow economies. Giving people a job creates jobs. When you give somebody a job, he'll help create more jobs. So, the legal venues to come to the United States have been too small to support this economy since the 1960s. And that's the reason why we're in the situation that we are. So creating legal opportunities for people to come here, in my mind, that's part of the fix. But if we do that, and some of the other big issues we should talk about, and we created a system, a rational system, I believe we have general compliance with the law.
Well, do you think amnesty is part of the quote-unquote solution?
Yeah, I think there is really a three-part solution to this, which is, I mean, I agree completely, creating the legal avenues. And in fact, we saw under the Bush administration continued slightly lower cap, but the Obama administration, the increase in H-2B workers. I mean, there was a backdoor guest worker program created without anyone noticing. About a third of the people coming from Mexico today actually are coming through guest worker programs. We haven't really noticed that. It hasn't been talked about very publicly. Lindsay Lowell has done some research on this at Georgetown University. It's actually a very interesting change because Congress wouldn't act. The Bush administration, the Obama administration carried it over, went ahead and just moved forward on this. The reality is we need to do this, and we need to figure out how we have simply a different visa system. It's also become so complex. We could just simplify this. And we should think about it not just as temporary visas. The great magic of this country is that people come to this country and want to make it their own. Not most people, not every person. I mean, a lot of people would probably want to go back, and that's wonderful too. And people should want to go back to their country of origin, and we should make it possible for people to go back to their country of origin and then come back again later if they want to. But some people will get married, have children, have a great opportunity, love America, and they'll want to stay here. And we should also make sure that when we have temporary worker programs, those folks have an avenue, if they comply with certain regulations, that they can dream about becoming an American and have that opportunity to become American if they choose to do so. Secondly, I think we do need an amnesty. We do need to figure out how we bring the 11 million people. It used to be 12 million, now we're actually down to a little bit, between 10 and 11 million people who are really in the shadows right now. How do we bring them into U.S. society, assuming that they have stayed crime-free, have contributed to the economy, which most of them have. You know, you can set some hurdles, but we want them to come into U.S. society fully. And third, I think you do need enforcement. And you know, I think one of the realities of this, I think you can fully enforce immigration laws as is. I don't think we want to spend resources, the amount of resources it would take to do it right now. But on the other hand, if we are going to change our visa system and the pressure is going to go down for people to come illegally, it's going to become much easier to do enforcement. It's going to be much less costly. It's going to be easier to find the people that are trying to skirt the system. And yeah, we want to do that. We want to have employer verification. We do need people at the border. We do want ways of making sure that people are then going through a rational system that hopefully we've created.
So I think the issue of amnesty is really just a question of strategy. Mm-hmm. The problem I've always had is with the argument is amnesty first, right? So the first thing we do is we legalize 11 million people. We kind of clean the slate, right? Well, we tried that in 1986, and of course it didn't work. We cleaned this. We had about 3 million unlawful in the country. We cleaned the slate, and the number went up to 11, 13 million. And the reason for that is the strategy is we're going to clean the slate, and then after we clean the slate, we were going to really enforce the laws, and we were going to really secure the border. And what we did is we cleaned the slate. We didn't really enforce the border. We never really created the temporary worker programs we needed. We never did enforcement. And then we belatedly started throwing money at enforcement. And the odd thing is if all you do is throw money at enforcement, and this is what we discovered in the 80s, 90s, we actually made the problem worse. Because if all you do is add security at the border, here's what happens. Before, the unlawful population was people would come, they would work seasonally, and then they would go back to Mexico. And then what happened is it became harder to get across the border, so they came, and instead of going back, they stayed.
And things happened, right?
Right. And then what happened is the other people that were trying to come in, they kept trying to come in because the transaction costs weren't that high for getting across the door back. So we actually, created an incentive for people to come here illegally by all we did was increasing border security. And of course, half the people that are here lawfully came in through lawful means and just overstayed, right? So we didn't fix the system, right? So what I would argue is there's two problems with an amnesty. First of all, if you start out with a general amnesty, the first thing you do is send out a very big, strong signal that we're never going to fix the system. So you empty the pool, and what will happen is the pool will just refill. The other thing is you immediately take the incentive off the table for people, for a large segment of the debate who really all they want is the 11 million voters and don't really care about fixing the system, right? The consensus to actually do the other things you need to do, which we agree on, never gets done.
But before you move on, who would those 11 million voters be voting for? I mean, can we make an assumption about that?
Well, today what we know is that Hispanics generally vote Democratic, and I think the assumption is that they will continue to vote Democratic for some time. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I'm a policy guy. I'm not a political guy. So these guys are fighting over votes, and how those votes actually turn out, I don't know, but that's what they believe. But
What do
I
you
think I mean, actually, I'm not sure. I mean, Latino voters, I think in the short term probably will vote more Democratic. In the long term, it's less clear that's true.
Yeah.
But I actually think you're right. I mean, I don't think you do an amnesty unless you also do unless you fix the visa system. I think you have to do both in tandem, and you have to do the enforcement, which we've actually already started to do pretty effectively. You know, I mean, there are the employer systems, that employer verification systems actually exist. They can be extended. They can be scaled up. But you do both, and people don't necessarily, I mean, I guess amnesty is probably the wrong term. We usually talk about regularization. You don't necessarily give people voting rights tomorrow. I mean, you allow people to go through a period of having a green card. You allow people, or you give them a blue card, or, you know, you give them some sort of provisional status. They stay on that, and they eventually earn the right to citizenship, the way other immigrants do. I think that's the way to do it. Reasonable people can disagree on how long that period should be. If you were to ask most people who don't have papers in this country, they would say that they would take permanent residency without citizenship. I mean, they would be happy simply to be able to come out of the shadows and be a functioning member of society, and they don't care about voting. They'd love to vote, but that's not their first priority. But I think normatively, as a democratic society, we do want people eventually to be full citizens in this country if they choose to be so. So we do want to include that in some way.
so I mean, so here's the way I would deal this is the first thing I would do is I would focus on not the easy part, which is giving an amnesty. That's easy. Anybody can do that. That's just spending a couple of, tens of billions of dollars to register people and give them English lessons and everything else. I would actually start with the hard part first, right? Which is I would get enforcement right. And I'm with you. I wouldn't be throwing gazillions of dollars in enforcement, but I would have an enforcement strategy that was designed primarily to create a culture of compliancy. I would create temporary worker programs and visa fixes that created a legal flow. And even if you piloted these visa programs, because there may not be a giant huge for temporary workers right now, but when the economy picks up, there will be. And so ironically, as this sounds, you actually ought to be piloting visa reforms and temporary worker programs when the economy is depressed, because then you can figure out the structures and how to get it right. And when people come back and want to come here, the highways are open for business, right? And you got to, and I'm for sensible border security, and we could talk about what that be. And the other thing we really have to do, and we haven't had this discussion at all, which is wrong, right? Which is, look, this is as much about Mexico as the United States. We can do whatever we damn well please. If Mexico doesn't change, a lot of things aren't going to change. And Mexico has issues in civil society, they have issues in economic freedom, and they have issues in public safety and security. And they're our neighbor, and we have to work with them, trying to help them deal with those issues. And then my argument would be, if you do that, a couple of things are going to happen. First of all, I think if we created the legal venues, I believe that there's a population in this country which is single, of an age, relatively transportable, that would actually willingly self-deport and come back in through a legal system. And I believe that number is actually in the couple of million.
Do you think that the number is that high of willing self-deporters?
No.
Why
Recent
not?
immigrants, I think you might get some recent immigrants, but for people who've laid down roots,
That's different.
Unless they feel that it is secure to come back, that they have a piece of paper in their hand before they cross that border, they're unlikely to take that risk. Now, recent immigrants, last 3 years, who are single, who have not set down roots in any way, might be willing to do that, right? I mean, if they feel it's credible enough, but it's going to be hard to get the vast majority of people to think that way.
And that's not the entire level.
And we don't need to do that. I mean,
Right.
I also think it is sort of an unnecessary way to go.
Well, I would disagree, but to some extent. But I do. I'm not saying it's everybody, but I think there is a significant population, particularly if you have things like sponsorship programs, for example. We have a lot of people who have workers, and they would love for that person to be legal. And they would tell them, look, if you go to your country and register and come back, dude, I will be the first person to put your name and ask you to come back. So
yeah, if you create a system that allows people to get some sort of document before they leave, where they have a sense of when they're coming back, I think people would do it.
So this gets to the point, which is, I think, is the crux of the thing, is it's not 11 million people. It's not. It's different piles that add up to 11 million. So there's a population which you could, I think, entice to self-deport, which isn't not insignificant.
There's a couple million who have visa applications pending, actually,
Right.
in that as well.
And there's
1.5 to 2
yeah,
million.
and there's some visa
so.
reforms that would clean just people that have just legal issues off the books. There's got to be at least, I don't know the number, but there's got to be 1 million that are criminal aliens and are never going to sign up for an amnesty because they never qualify, right? So those people you literally are going to have to hunt down. I mean, and then at the end of the day, you're going to be left to the people that are really problematic, which are people that have been here for a very, very long time and have children that are born here or are U.S. citizens. And that's an issue that the country's going to have to come to grips with in a way that's fair and compassionate, everything else. I understand that people say, you don't want to reward people who've broken the law the longest. But at the end of the day, we're going to come down to a population that's in the several million that are hard cases. And the country's going to have to figure out how to deal with it. But here's the difference is I think the country would, as an American people who are at their heart generous and compassionate, would be much more willing to have that discussion if they saw a system that didn't look like it was broken anymore.
What do you do with the family that has been here for 10 years, has 3 children, has a job, has a house, has all these roots? Do you just say, we're going to let you stay because of all of that? Or is there another way of handling it?
I think you do, actually, assuming there's no criminal record, assuming they've been contributing members of society. Yes, I think you do. And I would actually do everything at once. I mean, I think you're only going to get one shot to deal with this thorny issue. And so I think you do deal with this at once, though there are ways you can come up with, and perhaps you don't fix everything at once. I mean, maybe you don't give citizenship, for example, to people who are regularizing their status the first time. But 10 years, we're going to have to do it. We're going to have to figure out how we make people who have been regularized, who have been given a blue card to stay permanently in the country, citizenship, so they become full members of society. So there are ways you could make it two-stage, but I would do it, first of all, I think the easiest way is to reach a political compromise between those who want to see temporary programs and those who want to see what do you do with the people who are in this country permanently, and try and do something. And actually, if I can disagree with one thing you said earlier, James, I think there is actually a negative, I think there is a drag on the economy with illegality, which is, generally speaking, people who are here without papers are paying taxes. I mean, they're paying property taxes directly or indirectly. Either they're paying rent or they're paying property taxes. They're certainly paying sales tax. A lot of them are paying income tax. And a lot of them are paying Social Security, though not necessarily into their own Social Security account. But there is a negative drag both on paying taxes. It's small, but it's significant. And there is a negative drag on people's long-term productivity. People don't necessarily invest in their own education and in their own future in the same way.
But
before you go there, what do you do with the hypothetical family that Andrew just addressed?
Well, my answer is look, you have to fix the system. If we're going to worry about...
No, but you have to do something with that family.
No, I don't,
That's
right? And here's the deal, I don't.
Why not?
That's just, what are you going to do with the guy on death row? Well, if we're going to make public policy about what I'm going to do with the hypothetical whatever, and we individualize it, then the system never gets fixed, and you have to fix the system. And here's where we completely disagree, right? We need a political compromise. Okay, I have a car. The brakes don't work, the steering wheel doesn't work, and the tires are flat. So we reach a political compromise. We're going to fix the tires and the steering wheel, and then we're going to drive the car, right? Well, no. It's a system. It's a flow. If you don't fix the problem never gets fixed.
But you're suggesting only fixing the tires and the steering wheel. I'm suggesting fixing the whole car.
I'm suggesting fixing them all. But the problem is you have to do it. And this is where we just.
But you want to do the tires and then drive it first, and then come back and fix the steering wheel.
Here's where we fundamentally disagree. I don't think we can do it in one grand bargain. We have to do it sequentially. And
we don't have enough money for the steering wheel?
Because some things take longer than others, right? You can grant an amnesty in a New York second, right? You can't get the enforcement piece right, you can't put the guest worker piece in place, and you can't do the security, and you can't work with Mexico in a nanosecond, right?
Actually,
the only thing you can do overnight is write a thing that says, okay, everybody gets amnesty.
Actually, I think the amnesty part, I mean, particularly if you're going to do it as earned regularization, where people have to meet certain criteria, is the only thing we don't know how to do. We actually do know how to do guest worker programs. We can scale up things that exist, although I think we should shift our visa system somewhat. I think we can simplify it a lot. But we do know how to do it, and we do know how to do enforcement. In fact, we do actually have an employer verification system that is imperfect, but 2 or 3 years from now is actually going to be in decent shape. Not all employers like it, but it is actually becoming something that is more and more reasonable and workable and believable. The one we actually don't know how to do well is the regularization piece. That's actually going to take us a lot more time, particularly if there are conditions built into this. We haven't done this since '86. We did it badly in '86. And so that's actually going to take an enormous investment. But I think we do all of them at once. Let's fix the whole system, and let's have a system that makes sense. Well, let me throw out if I can
You want to
take
fix
this
the
a different-
system, you want to fix the system, but you don't agree about the interim steps.
Well, but that's you know what but the point is this is the debate we should actually be having. We both envision the same end state, right? And the debate is about what's the most efficient and effective way to get to the end state. Unfortunately, people like us aren't making the law. The people that are making the law are wanting to do what's politically convenient for them, right? And their primary goal, I don't care what they say, their primary goal is not to fix the system. Their primary goal is to do something, maybe some piece of that.
Or to appeal to a constituency,
Right,
one side or the other.
But nobody, including the people, including the government in Mexico, which in some respects has disincentives to fix the system. You get 40, I guess, I don't know. Again, these numbers were all before, when we had a real economy. When a dollar, when a dollar really was a dollar, like a Canadian dollar. But a couple of years ago, the United States was putting out $40 billion in remittances. A vast amount of it went to Mexico. And if you're, from a Mexican perspective, if you got this cash flow, why would you want to do anything else? If I'm getting this cash flow coming in my country and I don't have to improve my economy, I don't have to do anything for people.
Well, you raise a great point, which is, I think, one of the things that we should do, actually, if we start having a serious debate on immigration in this country, is sit down with the Mexican government. Back in 2006 and 2007, when there was a serious debate, didn't go as far as it could have, but there was a serious debate going on with the administration and Congress. Leaders in Congress seemed to be pushing the same direction. A number of people in the Mexican Congress and the administration got together and said, if the U.S. moves forward on this, we would agree to enforce the border so that we can let people go through the new legal systems to get to the United States, visa system. We would want to work with the United States on development issues in Mexico. There began to be a serious discussion among Mexican elites about how they could work with the U.S. government to reduce migration pressures and also support a legal flow system. This is a debate we should be having, and if right now we don't have a lot of credibility, I don't think any side has a lot of credibility on this issue in the United States, but to the extent that we have some credibility and we move forward, this is a conversation we could be having with the government of Mexico and with other people in Mexican society, and we hope that receptivity is still there, because they should have a huge interest in making sure that in Mexico that people have an opportunity to stay in their country, that some people will always come here because, as you said, it is a way you build up your assets, but there's also a huge advantage to Mexico in the most entrepreneurial citizens staying at home and contributing to the future of the country.
Well, that's right. I encountered when I went to Mexico, I encountered two groups of people. One people, you terrible Americans, why are you building a wall? I hate you. And the other people say, I am so sorry, I apologize to you that you have to build a wall to protect us from our country. And then the third group of people were saying, we are victims because the people that have energy and drive, and they're going to America, and we're not getting them back. But you think about a difference if you had a Mexico where you had an opportunity for economic freedom, and you were putting $40 billion into an economy that could actually turn that money into wealth. I mean, it's very, very interesting to look at where remittances go in Latin America and what they're used for. In a few places, they actually go to somebody takes it back and they grow a business. In a lot of places, they buy rent, they buy food. I mean, they're very subsistence things that are not contributing to economic growth. So there's a big argument that we need to spend as much time thinking about what's going on south of us as north of us. And then part of this is our problem too, and the things that we don't talk about, which we should, like agricultural subsidies. Right? We have huge corn agricultural subsidies. What that did very effectively was destroy the Mexican agricultural industry. So it's cheaper to buy a tamale that's made in the United States and ship the corn to Mexico than it is to grow corn in Mexico. And then the awesomeness of this whole irony is because we're giving these subsidies and now we're doing it for ethanol and we're growing so much corn, we have to have workers that know how to do this. So what do? We recruit illegal workers from Mexico to come to the United States and grow corn. So I mean, actually,
I couldn't agree with you
if
more
we got
on this
rid
one. Yeah,
if we got rid of agricultural subsidies, it would be a boon to the Mexican economy, which would help actually go a long way towards decreasing.
I think that's a huge area. I mean, about 46% of workers coming from Mexico to the U.S. are coming from agricultural areas. That was true about 5 years ago. I'm not sure that's still true. Only about 25% of people in Mexico live in agricultural areas. What it tells you is there's a huge pressure because particularly small-scale agriculture has been dying in Mexico. So we could do a great deal with this. Yeah. And the other thing we could do that would be great, getting back to the border, I mean, is we've spent a lot of resources on between ports of entry.
Right.
The reality is the greatest threats to the United States are increasingly not between ports of entry. I mean, if someone's going to bring in a chemical weapon of some sort, it's more likely to actually go through a port of entry. Most of what we catch right now in terms of narcotics coming north, for example, is marijuana. We actually know that marijuana is only 20-25%, according to RAND, of the profits of the Mexican cartels. we're catching very little of it because, well, we're concentrated on what's going on between ports of entry. That's where marijuana comes in. We're not catching cocaine, heroin, or meth. We're also not catching weapons sold in the United States that are going south to arm the cartels. We're not catching drug money. We are highly focused on what goes on between the ports. If we were less worried about, because we're primarily focused on immigrants coming into this country, if we were to take some of that pressure off, and we never will stop enforcing between ports of entry. I mean, there will always be a reason to do that. We want people to move through legal systems. But if we were talking about a small number of people coming across illegally as opposed to a large number, it becomes increasingly easy to focus on terrorism and on organized crime, flows both going north and going south, which are real threats to the United States and real threats to Mexico. And we could really reorient our border policy in a much more proactive way.
Yeah, well, there are those who say that if the United States changes its drug policy, it would have a big effect on the border.
Okay,
So
what they need to do is look at the numbers, right? There's now a huge drug consumption in Mexico, so there's a domestic market that's not going away. And there's a huge drug market in Europe. So it goes through Mexico, going to North Africa and the United States. So the days when we're not even the number one in the drug market anymore. It's pathetic, right? I mean, the days
We're still number one, but we're
right,
not.
yeah,
We're not alone.
But the
Yes.
days when we were the only game in town for Mexican drug cartels are long over. So that argument doesn't. Look, this is a $40 billion a year industry. They're the only people that didn't ask for stimulus money or a bailout. Look, these cartels are not going. They're not going to go quietly into the night. But the point I wanted to get in was I think it's really interesting that we've talked for I don't know how long here. We've almost never said the word border once, right? And that was a topic because I think we both agree that the problem isn't
at the border.
Well, there are problems at the border, but that's not the biggest problem. And where I wanted to agree with you is where we are underinvesting in the border is not in the amount of money we're pouring into security. I think we're misspending a lot of that money. Right. We're not putting the money into investment in the infrastructure at the border.
Agreed. Because
we're losing billions and billions of dollars in transaction costs for people sitting and waiting in lines at the hour. So you have to realize if you take an extra 10 seconds at the border crossing point, because of the way the mathematics works, if you're at the back of the line, every extra 10 seconds at the back of the line turns into hours. Mm-hmm. It's incredible. Right, and so and you go to some of these border crossing points where everybody is funneling through this tiny little thing. So if we were investing in border infrastructure, right?
And what's border infrastructure mean?
Bridges, roads, lanes. So facilitating the movement of goods quickly and securely through the border, which you need more infrastructure to do. If you want security and you want speed, you have to have more infrastructure there.
And I would add to that, I mean,
and it would help security
I completely agree. I think that's a huge investment. We've actually seen this increase first under the Bush administration, now the Obama administration. They actually have put more money into this. But the other thing is also pre-inspection. I mean, can we begin doing risk segmentation in general at the border,
right,
but also finding those companies that comply with strict standards for shipping, that can have lower, I mean, no one gets no inspection, but are less likely to get inspection when they get to the border. We can, in the long term, think of no inspection at the border. You can actually put GPS devices on, cameras, monitor cargo that goes from a pre-inspection facility all the way to the U.S., but we're probably not quite there yet. But in the long term, we could do that.
We could probably talk about this for another 15 hours and then just be scratching the surface. But I wanted to thank you both for agreeing to be here. It was a pleasure, and thank the audience for being so attentive. And thank the World Affairs Council for putting this together.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.